My name is Dr. Darrell Racine. Welcome to the podcast Stolen Science. This podcast is about Indigenous contributions to Western European science between 1670 and 1870. This podcast is for academics, but more so for Indigenous youth. I want Indigenous people to understand the significant contributions that Indigenous people made to not only Western science, but to Western culture. This is it's not talked about, and there's not very much academic information about it. So I felt that it was important so that Indigenous people can ensure in the future that their rights are preserved. Now, for academics, Indigenous, but more so for non-Indigenous academics, why is this work important? It's important because it's going to provide you with a framework by which to do research, appropriate research that actually looks at Indigenous people as an equal rather than as being passive in the fur trade, in the conjunction of the advancement of science. They were not passive. They never were. And so you can come to a better understanding about how research can be done in the context of the history of Western Canada that provides a fair and balanced historical view of Indigenous people. The reason I'm doing this podcast is because I think that historians have missed a very critical part of history that involves Indigenous people and the extraction of Indigenous knowledge from Western Canada between 1670 and 1870. And without this history, what happens is that when that history is unknown or absent, then racism or perspectives of Indigenous people can get twisted, and or racism can emerge from that historical narrative when the Indigenous perspective and the Indigenous contributions are not acknowledged. Now, to start, I want to get some basic information out of the way about racism and assumptions about Indigenous people in Canada. In order to understand why this topic is so important, we only need to look back at an article that was published on November 23rd in the National Post. The article was called "Canada Wasn't Stolen from Indigenous People." This article, which was written by Thomas Flanagan and Mark Milkey, clearly demonstrate that there is a misunderstanding of the historical narrative of Canada. They assume certain stereotypes about Indigenous people. Now, in general in Canadian society, when we come across stereotypes, we're not really, like we see them, but these are academics. These people are writing in a national paper. So it's very important that we understand, in a sense, what they're saying and the impact that has on Indigenous people, or how people think about Indigenous people. Indigenous people are immigrants too. And so no special status should be given to Indigenous people because they're immigrants too. Well, problem with that argument is that when we talk about time immemorial, we're talking about a significant, or forever in a sense. Forever, like Indigenous people have been here for forever. Now, if we go off to the Western European interpretation of how North America was populated, if we just go off that basic, then we say, okay, well, Indigenous people and the Western academics will accept that, Indigenous people came 20,000 years ago. The way to take this apart is, or to understand it, is we need to first go back to an author called Wayne Wary, who wrote a book back, I think it was about maybe 20 years ago now, called Unfinished Dreams. And in this book, he comes up with 3 common arguments that non-Indigenous academics and people in the Canadian population use to indicate that Indigenous people should not have the rights that they argue for. So the first point is Indigenous people are no different than any other minority group. Okay, so where does this come from? This comes from the idea of the Bering Strait theory and that there were 3 times that Indigenous people, according to Western archaeology, 3 times when Indigenous people came across the Bering Strait. 20,000 years ago, I think 10,000 years ago, and I think 3,500 years ago. The idea being that since they came across the Bering Strait, and it's not that I'm buying into that particular theory. I think there are certain kind of merits to it, but there could be other ways in which Indigenous people came to North America. Indigenous people will say that they have been here since time immemorial. In a sense, what they would say, forever. Now, what Western academics tend to think is that because they have the archaeological evidence that Indigenous people came at earlier times, that they are an immigrant, like an immigrant to North America 400 years ago or 500 years ago, and that that's the same status. Well, when we think about the expanse of human history, we know that writing, for example, was not invented until about 5,000 years ago. And agriculture did not begin in Mesopotamia until 10,000 years ago. Well, if Indigenous people have been here for 20,000, according to Western archaeological evidence, then I would say that they have been here time immemorial. In other words, that span of time, according to the Western academics, that span of time is time immemorial. And so this idea that 400 years can be compared to 20,000 years is ridiculous. And then to call Indigenous people immigrants. And then I think one of the other made points is that might makes right. This is what they kind of say. Well, as a European colonizers, we were much stronger, and we had an army, and we were much stronger, and so this is the way that human existence works. Because we're stronger, we come in, we take over. Sorry, that's just the way it is. The winners write the history. That in itself identifies those people that have been overtaken by conflict or whatever, that they are in fact inferior. And within that, might makes right is also that technology makes right. And what I mean by that is that because the Europeans perceive themselves, and even today, as more advanced than Indigenous people, that they had science, that they had writing, and when they arrived in the Americas, that most Indigenous people did not have any writing, did not have any what could be recognized as Western European science. And so therefore, we are a much more advanced culture, and that Indigenous people should be thankful for introducing that. The next major point that Wary makes is that most of Indigenous people have been assimilated. So why should you give them special status if they've been assimilated? So because an Indigenous person drives a car, therefore they have been assimilated. Because they speak English, because they work in the oil field, or because they, have this education, that they have in fact been assimilated. And so therefore do not deserve any special rights. The problem with this is that cultures change over time. All cultures change over time. And to show how ridiculous this is, I only have to give the example of, in 1900, let's say 1880, let's go to Western Canada, 1880, non-Indigenous people, Europeans, were in covered wagons. They were moving across the prairies. They had probably a musket in the, Now, if I look at Europeans today in Western Canada, they don't still drive wagons and they still don't have a musket. Things have changed. Cultures are allowed to change and retain their identity. But for some reason, when we start looking at some of the arguments by people that feel that Indigenous people don't have rights, is that they use that argument that Indigenous people have been assimilated. In other words, that if your cultural changes, that you are no longer that particular identity. So I would say that Canadians, that you can't call yourself you can't call yourself a Canadian today because you're not exactly like the Canadians that were here in 1880. So it's a ridiculous argument, but it's one that's often made. And the third one is that Indigenous rights have been relinquished by treaties. Now, Indigenous people say that treaties are sacred. Unfortunately, when Indigenous people signed those treaties, they didn't understand the full impact of what was going to happen after those treaties were signed. They also didn't understand the larger international order outside of North America very well, in the sense that the implications, the legal implications, for example, of these treaties and how they would be legally interpreted once they were signed. So when they say that treaties have been relinquished or that Indigenous rights have been relinquished by treaty, then it's a bit of a misnomer because those treaties were never enacted as Indigenous people thought they should have been. For example, sharing the land. That never happened. After the treaties were signed, Indigenous people were put on reserves, and I think until 1930, they weren't even allowed to leave the reserve until they had permission from the Indian agent. So did Indigenous people know this when they signed the treaty, that they would have to go on reserve and that they had to stay there? Did they know that, their other rights would be taken away, the right to practice their own traditions, the right to educate their own children? No, they didn't. And no one that could have known that would have signed those treaties. In those treaties it says, share the land. Well, there's 5 reserves within 100 kilometers of me that are less than 10 square kilometers. That's not sharing the land. And that never happened. The idea that everything is shared. So for the assumption that, you signed treaties and therefore you no longer have rights, is highly problematic. But yet, this is where these arguments often go to when we talk about Indigenous rights in Canada. So now, when we transfer those arguments of Wayne Wary over into this article, it becomes very obvious. You can actually see what they're trying to do. For example, the article states, and I quote, "The notion that some groups in the Americas have been here since time immemorial and are thus indigenous in the truest sense of that term is evolutionary and historically false." So, they're getting the readers to buy into the idea that Indigenous people have not been here in time immemorial. They're getting us into the idea that Indigenous people are just immigrants, just like everyone else in Canada, therefore they deserve no rights. This is false, and it is racist. The second quote, this is a little longer, so please, be patient. "A stronger argument might be that the latter settlers owe the families of the earlier settlers for stealing their land, which is a popular claim. However, that assertion ignores the multitude of treaties signed across Canada, as well as the very approach by the colonial British and Sir John A. Macdonald that treaties were preferable to brazen conquest, as happened with other empires throughout history, including those now labeled Indigenous." Now, treaties were preferable to brazen conquest. These treaties, and I guess the way that you need to think about them, is it's kind of like a corporate takeover. And what do I mean by that? Well, if we look at the sale of the Hudson's Bay Company, which covered all of Western Canada, this occurred in 1867. It was sold to Canada for $300,000. Now, sold for $300,000, but the Hudson's Bay Company retained 1 in every 10 square miles. Well, the head of the Hudson's Bay Company, Donald Smith, later known as Lord Strathcona, was also the head of the Bank of Montreal. The Bank of Montreal financed the Canadian Railway. Now, if you think about it, the Hudson's Bay Company was changing from a fur trade into a mercantile store. They chose that land along the railway. So Donald Smith, who was also a member of Parliament, head of Bank of Montreal, commissioner of the Hudson's Bay Company, had a plan. And that plan had to include that Indigenous people were treated and put on reserves. Why? Because if you were going to invite an influx of settlers, the last thing you wanted was a bunch of Indians running around Western Canada where they weren't controlled. And if we think of the history of Western Canada, we think of the 1885 Northwest Rebellion or the 1869 Red River Insurrection. So Indigenous people, whether it be Métis or First Nations, was a problem with populating that West. So you had to actually make those treaties so that you could actually control Indigenous people. And that's what was done. And so when we think about those treaties, we're also talking about, and the reason I say corporate takeover is because Donald Smith was behind the clearing of those plains. It was a methodical process where you got government involved. You had the Hudson's Bay Company, which was transitioning from the fur trade over into a mercantile base. And those forces working together had to have Indigenous people under control so that land could be taken. And that is why they came up with the treaties. And yes, the treaty language sounds good. And then they promised all sorts of things to Indigenous people, like the land would be shared. The land is not shared, it never was. It was taken. And it was taken by government in the conjunction with a corporate entity. The third issue I have with this article is that the article also states that Canada's expenditure on Indigenous programs last year was about $32 billion. Later in the article, they say that Canada's GDP is around $2.5 trillion. So about 1.5% of our GDP is spent on Indigenous people per year. But Indigenous people represent 5% of the Canadian population. So this idea that, we're spending all this money on Indigenous people is a crock of poop. Now, would Indigenous people like to change it? Yes, they would. They would like to have more control. And we can talk about that in a later episode. For the next few episodes, what I want to provide you with is an outline of how Europeans and settlers stole Indigenous knowledge and then integrated it into the scientific frameworks of Europe, thereby hiding the fact that Indigenous people made significant contributions to science. Yeah, I mean, you can't really read a history book that will tell you that. I mean, if you go in the library and search for that kind of stuff, then you find, these little books about how Indigenous people contributed, corn and squash and no, Indigenous people contributed a lot more than that to Western European science and to Western European culture. And this needs to be known, especially by Indigenous people, so that they can ensure the rights for themselves and for their future communities can thrive within what is today called Canada. In conclusion, it's very important that Indigenous youth understand that there is a strong, unwritten history of Indigenous contributions to science, and that they have a lot to be proud of in regards to their ancestors' contributions. In regards to academics, if you continue on with the podcast, you're going to find new methods and ways in which to do research on Indigenous historical issues. In the next podcast, we're going to look at what the relationship was between British imperial science and the Hudson's Bay Company. It was an intimate relationship, it was integrated, and once you understand the full context of it, you'll start to see the Hudson's Bay Company not just as a fur trade company, but one where science was produced and extracted from Western North America. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, and further information can be found on the website in the description below. Thank you.